Would you care to relate the situation of Anglo-atheism to what you've called the fundamental division in American society between Jews, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and Catholics?
Yes, this is that division is based on a sociological theory called the triple melting pot, which basically says that there is no one American. We have the myth of the melting pot, and actually during World War I, we had melting pot pageants put on by the CPI, which is the propaganda ministry at that time, where they put up a big pot in the middle of a baseball field, and people would march up wearing their ethnic clothing from wherever they came from, playing their ethnic instruments. They go into the pot, and then the band under the band shell would strike up the Star Spangled Banner, and they'd all march out wearing suits and bowler hats. That doesn't work. That's propaganda. That's not reality. The reality of the situation is that basically people come. This is formulated during the period of European immigration. Okay, uh, people come from all over the world, but primarily from Europe. And when they get here, after 3 generations, they form an ethnic group based on their religion. And so there are three ethnic groups based on three religions: Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. I didn't understand this really until I did a book on Medjugorje, which led me to study the history of Yugoslavia. And I realized America's Yugoslavia. It's basically three ethnic groups based on three religions. And the other angle is that they're always at war with each other. And this is something that I suddenly realized in the history of the United States, there has never been an American. It's always been one of a particular kind of group. And they're at war with each other. So this solved the problem because that I was having about understanding the motivation behind birth control. We all know that birth control is a form of uh, population control. It's a form of sexual liberation. It's a form of political control. If you introduce it into a culture, you weaken the culture. And if you're really good at it, you destroy the culture because people stop having kids uh, completely. This is the crisis in Iran right now. They've had the biggest drop in fertility in birth control history, and I'm trying to talk to these people about pulling them out of that demographic tailspin. Okay, so why were the Rockefellers so interested in promoting birth control? Because they did it because they were involved in ethnic warfare. They represented the WASP ruling class when there actually was a WASP ruling class, and their main opponent, given the triple melting pot, were the Catholics. And the main characteristic of Catholics from the Rockefeller point of view is they did not use birth control. So they couldn't really say, okay, let's get the Catholics to use birth control. Now, they did do this. They did organize secret conferences at Notre Dame to change the church's teaching on contraception. Father Hesburgh, the late president of Notre Dame, organized a personal meeting, personal audience between John D. Rockefeller III and Paul VI during the summer of 1965. And during that meeting, Rockefeller volunteered to write the birth control encyclical that the Pope eventually issued as Humanae Vitae. So he did try to change it. But in general, what you have to do is it's like television, it's broadcast. We're going to change the default settings of the entire culture, and that has collateral damage. And the collateral damage mainly was the WASP ruling class went out of existence because they were the first people to show up at the birth control clinic. That's the story of that. But I mean, it also allowed me to realize that the only way you can make sense of this type of thing is if the United States is in a constant situation of ethnic warfare, which I think it was. It is. So as I said my son went to Harvard. Why did my son go to Harvard? He's not from elite New England school. He lived in Indiana, which is not an elite place. I gave a talk once and I said the main criterion for getting into Harvard is existence. If you don't exist, you can't get into Harvard, and that's precisely what happened. The WASP ruling class failed to have children, the children failed to go to Harvard, and so there was a gap, and it had to be filled by somebody, and people like my son ended up there. The other main group that ended up at Harvard was the Jews. And the reason they ended up at Harvard is because a man by the name of Kaplan taught a tutoring course in Brooklyn, a prep course for the SATs. This is in Nicholas Lemon's book, The Big Test, if you want to read the whole story. But basically, Kaplan uh, um, had parties after his course, after the kids had taken their SATs, and the criterion for getting into the party was you had to give them one question. So by the time he'd given the course X number of times, he knew every single question on the SATs. The Jews who took his course all got perfect scores, 1600s, and they all got into Harvard. And this was part of the turning, the changing of the guard that took place over the 1970s when the WASP ruling class went into eclipse and it was replaced by a Jewish ruling class, which is the situation that we have today. The crucial turning point, I would say, was 1978 when John D. Rockefeller III and Nelson Rockefeller died. This was also the moment with the beginning of the rise of the neoconservatives, which is a Jewish political movement, which basically took over our foreign policy in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. But that's a nutshell, in a short summary, I suppose, of the triple melting pot and where it came from and where it took us.